Got X-ray flashes on the eastern limb and cresting into view. Incoming sunspots collide with the Earth-facing solar quiet. They do battle, and the result right now is in the middle, C-class and low M-class events. Each of the larger flares were impulsive. Some minor surface surging was all that we could see. And the lone flare that was of extended duration occurred behind the limb, and we just caught a reading of the energy from the side. Let's hop over to spaceweathernews.com and find this modest flaring uptick includes 2 M-class events, and the big test of these spots is at hand. The large group facing Earth is a bit messy, and perhaps we can see delta potential in the middle of the umbral zone behind the large lead. Appears mostly positive blue. We should also not miss the new spots cresting over the limb at the moment. Eyes on our star. Let's quickly come to the solar wind. That blue phi-angle twist yesterday sparked some beautiful southern auroras, but in general, the coronal hole stream is waning as the speed creeps down slower and slower. Earth's magnetic field is calming now, and remember that because by this weekend we'll see less of the tropical storms as well. Twin typhoon candidates east of the Philippines there. So the geomagnetic and tropical storms are waning. Mars and Jupiter are conjoining in the morning sky, and we've got the next coronal hole coming in now. Red negative as opposed to the lengthy presence of positive green. Sounds like all the quake factors are present, especially since that incoming coronal hole looks tremendously powerful. So there's nothing standing in the way of, oh, you gotta be kidding me. Folks, that coronal hole died last night, totally lost its force. This is one of the starkest drops in earthquake-making power I've ever seen, and just as everything was coming together. Some last little notes on this before a summary. This is a solar wind chart for the entire last year, and last week's KP7 event was caused by a dense shockwave leading the fastest solar wind of the last 12 months. That's saying something. But more importantly, it was followed by the highest electron flux of the last 12 months, and that plays a huge role in the charging and discharging capacitor model for space weather-driven earthquakes. So, the Earth is charged up from the electrons, the planets are conjoining, the magnetic and tropical storms are going to be gone soon, and the IMF from the coronal hole switches from positive to negative. The coronal hole power is gone, but what if it comes back just as fast as it left? The timing of the next earthquake uptick should mirror the force of that coronal hole. Keep a close eye. How about a little whoops from NASA? They say that Antarctica has had record-high ice for years, and that's true. They say, however, it's struggling to meet the mark this year, and that's true. But they have declared the maximum reached on October 6th. And that's a lovely bouquet of oopsie-daisies, NASA. As their decisive declaration was being prepared, the ice began surging. And folks, this is from 2 days ago. For the first time in my watching, it was not updated yesterday. Interesting. Got a low-pressure system in the east. It will be driving the first snowfall of the year for this region as temperatures could dip into the 20s, maybe lower. However, we're also focused on the southwest as pressure is driving Pacific moisture over Los Angeles and it drops wherever it meets a convergence line. Mudslides and damage have already taken place, and with the drought, it's going to happen every big rain for a while. High pressure blocking most of Europe except for the southeast coastlines and a bulge of green into Central Europe. Watch how the storms stick to those areas. They don't have much of a choice. Weather sticking to the lows near Antarctica here, except for a very familiar-looking convergence between nations. Weather shares from the South Island, starting on the southeastern limb, where a gorgeous coronal mass ejection rips away from our star, followed by chain reaction, flare, and ejecta events just north and out ahead on the Earth-facing disk. One destabilization sets off many. The solar flaring in general has plateaued for now. No big flashes like we saw yesterday, and the thin dark plasma filaments all appear stable this morning. Let's jump to spaceweathernews.com to find solar flaring in C range, but indeed, no more M flares, and the Earth-facing solar quiet takes another round. Lead sunspots decayed facing Earth, the bigger one behind them lost delta magnetism and has stopped bigger flaring. Even the extended duration flare maker at the limb has gone silent since catching a glimpse of Earth. The solar wind speed, in yellow, keeps dropping. That means we're returning to ambient calm, and Earth's magnetic shield's doing just fine this morning. Quake factor review. We have Mars and Jupiter lining up right now in the morning sky, and we have the incoming coronal hole. The big positive opening departs up north while the smaller area is negative off the south. Now please remember yesterday, when the left side red power to that coronal hole disappeared. The force dropped out. Watch the dates up top. They do project out a few days ahead. But this morning, not only is there no update, but yesterday's updates are gone now as well. The image we showed yesterday has been removed, and we're now faced to look at projection from 3 days ago. Odd, but not alone in suspicion today. You might also remember that there was a dramatic spike upward in ice cover down in Antarctica. Now you see it, now you don't. That's both of our incredible readings from yesterday, somehow wiped from the record. Top articles of the day begin with Enceladus, Cassini offering up multiple awesome shots on its flyby, the first of many we'll get from its close approaches in the coming days. Amazing look there. Also got one from the ESA about water, carving out Mars during floods, and one from NOAA on the anniversary of GOES 1, 40 years. Prayers going to the Philippines, please. They need it. A massive low-pressure node cresting Alaska is driving storm activity up and down the west coast. Off to the east, a low-pressure node is complemented by the north-central high and drives warm air up in the west, and Arctic air down in the east between the cells. It is brisk, to be sure. Across the pond, our top alert is by far the storm at the coast of Portugal y España. Eyes on it, and down under there is scattered weather, but you've all dealt with. Here's the last 24 hours on our star. Now there's no Earth-directed explosions, but that's about the only calm news I've got for you today. The 3 brightest areas here in 304 angstroms are the sunspots of note, 1 out ahead facing Earth and 2 coming over the limb. The lead is calming, but those 2 behind are trying to get something going. Churning, surging, trying to flare, and flare they did. A short but relevant uptick in flaring took place yesterday, predominantly from the southern sunspot group of those 2 just coming in now. A couple nice flashes in 131 angstroms. Let's jump to spaceweathernews.com and see that one of those did break into M-class range. And let's go over and check out the sunspots themselves. The big one facing Earth retains a little bit of magnetic mixing on the north end, but it has succumbed to the Earth-facing quiet. Big boy incoming up north has chosen to become quiet as well. The M flare, as we mentioned, is from the group thinking he's home free on the south there and able to flare. Let's see if the Earth-facing quiet can knock down its 7th sunspot in a row in just 5 days. We have a geomagnetic storm alert today due to the arrival of a speedy coronal hole stream. The leading density shockwave struck overnight, and now the energized particles are taking their crack at our magnetic shield. Speaking of coronal holes, the next one has come in to directly face Earth on the equator, so with the planets aligned, we would expect an uptick, but only a moderate quake uptick due to continued weak force to that coronal hole. The red is gone on the left. Consequently, we did get above average rumbles, but again, not too big. Argentinian quake did hit 6, but was downgraded. In Costa Rica, dos erupciones pequeños al volcán Turrialba. They are also raising the volcano alert in northern New Zealand today. Tasmania recovering from major wind gusts that are also moving on to New Zealand now. Radioactive particles detected in Finland by the National Detection System. California mudslides. Folks, this is the type of thing we've discussed where too big of a rain after a long drought really isn't how you want to cure the situation. Making matters worse is that the mud is now drying, solidifying, confounding the cleanup. They won't even start cleaning up for a while in the Philippines, typhoon overhead and bringing strong winds to accompany the major rainfall. The reason why they won't get a chance to clean up for a while can be seen when I push forward into forecast tracks of the storms. The one over the Philippines isn't moving. Stratospheric polar vortices shows the north revving up strongly for this time in mid-October. You're going to see pressure-driven temperature swings in the United States, then pressure-driven storms across the pond, 2 weak convergences down under. The carbon monoxide concentration concerns. As you'll remember, we've got incoming sunspots on the north and the south, and we've been seeing solar flares at the limb as they crest. In addition to the flares, we've seen filaments rip away, like this one last night. Some of the ejecta was recaptured, as you can see. Coming over to spaceweathernews.com, we find the Earth-facing quiet wins another round. 3 different M-flare-making sunspots have all gone silent upon seeing our blue sphere. Let's go ahead and check out the spots. The largest lead ones appear to retain magnetic mixing at the north end despite their quiet. The incomer up north looks to have a delta-class magnetism in the back despite its quiet. And check out the decay and spread in that southern group that popped in M-flare just 2 days ago. Yesterday, we pointed out the coronal hole stream impact in the solar wind. Density drops off, speed rises in yellow. Although it's not a major stream, it was enough to tweak Earth's weakening magnetic system, surge particles into the auroral electrojet, and lit up the skies at high latitude, especially over western Canada and the United States. That's the top induction potential zone. A minor geomagnetic storm cropped up, and its low level is the only thing keeping me from definitively saying that the SoCal power plant explosion at the exact peak of the storm yesterday, remember 7 a.m. in Cali is the middle of the day UTC, in the exact place we've seen issues this year already, is space weather driven. Again, my only reservation is that they say it was only a level 1 geomagnetic storm. Well, folks, our top quake of the last day is another near 6-pointer, moderate only for that part of the world. But last night over at QuakeWatch.net, I elevated the watch level to high for the first time in weeks. This is due to a number of factors like the planets conjoining for resonance amplification, the primary factor, equatorial coronal hole, even though it's not terribly powerful. And we do not expect further geomagnetic activity today. The tropical disruptions are waning over the Philippines, heading northeast of Japan, or just running a solo trek through the central Pacific. If the storms stay on a weakening track, we should see the lithospheric disruption. Article of the day is about the North Atlantic blob. It looks like the killer polar vortex events are going to hit Europe the hardest this year. Solid read. And so let's jump to the weather there and peek in, find that same low and storm system in the southwest. High pressure, clearing clouds in the eastern United States, driving the temperature swing, but also aiding in severe hailstorms coming to the desert southwest. Coming down under, you see the Antarctic lows trying to creep up to south-central Australia, and that is indeed where the storm activity. The top eruption threat on our star is filamentary. These thin dark lines you see dancing about are plasma ropes, and they can destabilize. They take the top solar watch because the incoming sunspots have completely succumbed to the Earth-facing solar quiet, belying the majesty of these incoming umbral magnetic fields. Over at spaceweathernews.com, we can see that flaring has remained low. Barely even C-class range. Coming to the sunspots, the incoming group has completely disbanded down south. The lead down south retains gamma magnetics, but there's extra spread between the northern end magnetism, and it's not interactive. And as diabolical as the incomer looks up north, it is predominantly beta situation with a traditional latitude spread, no deltas. The solar wind is waning back to ambient levels, and until the next coronal hole stream arrives, likely late tomorrow, we expect no geomagnetic storms, which combined with the coronal hole and planetary geometry made us push up the earthquake alert level to high yesterday. But over at QuakeWatch.net last night, you'll find a different tune, because it was clear that the expected tropical storm weakenings were not happening. Twin typhoons got 2 more candidates cropping up behind them. Olaf hit Category 4 in a major intensification event, and we even have another system brewing south of Mexico. That's too much atmospheric disruption, and I had to pull back the alert before bed last night. However, a significant earthquake has occurred, according to the USGS. While not huge, this area of the Philippines is not used to seeing earthquakes this big. And by the way, the top 2 quakes of the last day being right here is not a coincidence. That's where the Earth spots are. Earth spot earthquakes. And looking over the last 30 days for a bit more info, there are only 7 significant earthquakes during that time, and 4 of them are aftershocks from Chile. That makes yesterday's Philippines quake the first significant rumble in 9 days, and the number 2 non-aftershock tremor of the entire last month. How about that? We've got another solid El Nino comparison between now and 1997, linked below, and also a before and after of last week's landslide at Steel Glacier. First, we know that a quasi-four-way geometry is at hand with Venus, Mars, and Jupiter in loose conjunction, producing resonance amplification of the spheres. That complements the primary earthquake factor, the coronal hole. This dark one here is the southern fields, red negative up across the equator, and these are indeed the only exposure Earth has to the southern fields in negative IMF. You see that on the Earth-facing half. Not only is this where Earth gets those fields, but they had an interesting surge in power yesterday. Watch the Earth-facing longitudes to find a surge in southern field power, just like we saw from the north during the September 16th Chile quake and tsunami. We're going to watch this twice so you can focus on the southern polar area on the left side of the chart. The huge red patch that shows up on October 20th and then disappears this morning is a strong short-term surge and peak in that field's magnetism. That's 3 factors, and here's Hook Echo's phi angle twirl making 4. Look at the blue shifting. 5 is the lack of geomagnetic storms. And finally, despite expected intensification of the southern Mexico system at some point, the West Pacific typhoons all weakened. 2 died, actually. And Olaf weakened as well. After peaking in wind speed, he stepped back. And with the disruption now seeking ground, we took a magnitude 7 earthquake in Vanuatu. We haven't had 6 quake factors going at once in a very long time. Let's jump to the sun. Yesterday we said the top eruption threat was filamentary, and the largest rope facing Earth indeed destabilized, but you can see there is lateral movement and collapse. No CME. SpaceWeatherNews.com shows a minor tick up into C-class range for solar flaring. The culprit is the incoming sunspot group up north. He's producing these moderate flashes as the largest Earth-facing sunspot, and the one that retains the most magnetic mixing. It's in the back. If that red holds in the middle of the blue, we could see more. We took a gamma ray burst early this morning, but more importantly, the local solar wind environment is increasing density, and this could be the lead edge of the next coronal hole stream. We'd watch for a density dropout followed by a ramp up in speed. If we get it, more USA. Low cuts up from the southwest into the north-central areas. That's where the rain comes. But nothing will compare to what the northwest coastlines will receive off that low stuck near Alaska. In Europe, it looks like these powerful lows up north are the main story, but the warmer waters of the Mediterranean are able to do more with their weak lows in terms of storm intensity. Down under, it's a much easier forecast. Low pressure cuts across New Zealand with a tail up to the Australian coastlines. That's where the tropical moisture is accessed and brought down into the mix. SpaceWeatherNews.com to find a long-duration solar flare this morning. It's the wider mound bumping up there. It is only a C4 flare, but the long duration tells us that a CME was likely produced, and that this is a post-filament release Hyder flare. Plasma filaments do not have pre-eruption X-ray flares. The repopulation of the field plasma after it ejects is what gives us the flash and flare. This eruption came near the departing southern sunspots and has produced a good... Let's begin the sunspot analysis at that lead group that set off the filament eruption. As the sunspot departs the Earth-facing disk, it now begins to grow and gain more negative polarity, only as it exits. The other big group has been defeated by the Earth-facing solar quiet. This is the only one of 8 sunspot groups to survive the last week, but he has been silenced in this position. As expected, the coronal hole stream impacted in the solar wind yesterday. The density bulge in orange is particle buildup as faster particles stream out and bunch up against slower ones like snow on a shovel blade, and as the stream hits, the speed in yellow and plasma temperature in green jump up. It's not too fast, so a touch of instability is all we saw from this event. No storms. Let's look at an Earth spot effect. Remember that at Mexico, the tropical Earth spot trigger is always due south of the effect, and what's due north of that storm? Popo volcano, giving us a cry. Beautiful acknowledgement of the electromagnetic disruption south of it over the water. Death toll is nearing 60 in the Philippines from their typhoon. Here's a precipitation graphic showing feet of rainfall in some areas. That's incredible. Folks, here we have the temperature anomalies from September according to the big red blotch over eastern Europe is now gone. Let's zoom in on Europe to find the jet stream breaking open right at that point, bending back and south and allowing Arctic air to funnel down in. That ultra-red area that we just saw over Europe has now been breaking their daily cold records by 2, 3, and 4 degrees. Not 0.2 or 3, but whole degrees. Winter warning for Europe may begin early. We're going to check the remaining typhoon near Japan, and then pull the pressure and radar projections. Starting with the full analysis of the CME we began reporting yesterday, we said it likely had an Earth-directed component, and now that we have fully updated C3 coronagraph sequences, including the raw images, it's clear that some ejecta is coming this way. And even though the bulk mass of the CME will miss Earth to the right from this view, a bit may have even shot wide enough to miss Earth to the left from this view. However, NASA's Enlil spiral is showing no impact whatsoever. Well, I'm inclined to believe my eyes, so we'll go with NOAA's Enlil spiral at this time, showing a weak impact Sunday. I still think it could be tomorrow. The CME was also strong enough to perturb the interplanetary magnetic fields and surge high-energy particles to Earth days ahead of that CME. On the opposite limb of the sun, we have seen that the next plasma filament is approaching. In another 2 days, it will become the primary eruption threat on our star. You can see the solar tornadoes dancing in black there. Now, that filament will be the top eruption threat because not much else is happening except for the Earth-facing solar quiet. We've got no other CMEs to discuss. And over at SpaceWeatherNews.com, we can see that X-ray solar flaring has flatlined. The last 8 sunspot groups have been dominated by silence, regardless of their magnetic complexity and field structure. That one's number 9. In other space weather news, we had a gamma ray burst yesterday from Cassiopeia. A second stream of the coronal hole swept past Earth, but it was only modestly powerful, like the first, and since it was the same polarity coronal hole that produced them both, there has not been much disruption with the second stream. If it looks like we are between coronal holes right now, that's because we are. The southern negative opening is departing while the large northern positive opening is yet to come in. The full sun heliographic with the Earth-facing side dead center shows there is an equatorial bulb just behind the limb a few days away. The last 24 hours, we saw an above-average tremor on the Canadian coastline, along with multiple rumbles from Pakistan down the Indian Ridge and west across the Antarctic Ridge. A couple of those hit magnitude 6 on some readers. Top news articles include a press release from the ESO about kissing stars. Apparently a titanic collision is about to occur in the Tarantula Nebula. By the way, Typhoon Champy will not hit Japan. The cold records continued falling in parts of Russia and Kazakhstan, but a break should come in the next week. Folks, Patricia, south of Mexico, is officially the strongest Pacific hurricane in history, and if you saw my magnetic Earth talk at Observing the Frontier, you know the list of events this one is joining. It is likely to devastate the Mexican coastline here in the next day. Meanwhile, Olaf will try to avoid Hawaii. Despite the strongest low in this view being in eastern Canada, the worst weather is coming to Texas. A flow off the Gulf of Mexico coming up to the north-central low is also stealing Patricia's sheared moisture, and that's going to be a day of flooding in the Lone Star State.